Hello, I'm Blaze and welcome back to Warframe, and today I would like to run through the ancient Egyptian deity-inspired Inaros. Inaros is a warframe that includes equal parts crowd control and combat healer frame with a healthy dose of toughness mixed in, leaving him as a warframe that begins to approach Trinity in terms of survivability. Acquiring Inaros is done by visiting Baro Katir in the relay, buying the Sands of Inaros quest and running through it. This quest is actually quite nice, and is a refreshing change since you can actually continue going through the quest without having to actually build each component along the way. Plus, as a bonus, you get the sacred vessel that you cart all over the star chart as a rather nice Lisette decoration at the end. Alternatively, you can also head over to the market to buy him immediately, complete with his own Warframe slot and a pre-installed reactor for 225 platinum. Statistically, Inaros is probably the most unique Warframe so far. He comes along with absolutely no shields, but instead boasts a base health pool of 550, which goes up to 2,200 at rank 30. And that's before you even add on Vitality, at which point his health goes up to 4,620. That's insane. And on top of all of that, he has 200 base armor. Throw on Steel Fiber and Armored Agility, and that goes up to 510. Meaning his effective health pool when equipping all three mods clocks in at 12,474. Holy actual balls. So moving along from that lunacy, he also has a standard 100 base energy capacity going up to 150 at rank 30, as well as a 1.0 sprint speed modifier. As far as included polarities go, he includes 2 depolarities by default in his mod slots, good to include Vitality and Steel Fiber among others, a dash polarity in his aura slot, again working quite well with a number of the more important auras, and interestingly also includes a dash polarity by default in the Exilus mod slot. Note that you still need to install an Exilus adapter to make use of this slot, just like any other Warframe, but it is still a noteworthy inclusion. Another noteworthy inclusion is that, on missions such as the Grineer Fomorian Core Hijack or other similar shield-dependent game types, the objective will actually obtain Inaros' health instead since he has no shields. This is actually not as big as a deal as you may think and is actually extremely convenient for those missions. Continuing the oddities, Inaros also comes along with not only 1 but 2 added passive abilities. His first and most noticeable passive is referred to as Undying. Upon running out of health, instead of entering the usual down stage, or just immediately keeling over when playing alone, he instead transforms into a sarcophagus. In this state, he can emit a beam to strike enemies around him and pull them in, slowly draining their health to refill his own. At lower levels, this basically means he can straight up revive himself. At higher levels, this ability on its own is kind of useless sadly, due to enemy armor scaling, but he will still absorb the health from enemies he tagged with his beam if teammates then hit those enemies. So it's a good idea to sweep the reticule around to tag as many enemies as possible and let your teammates do the rest. His second passive is that upon performing any standing finisher, Inaros will regain 20% of his maximum health. This combined with his other abilities gives him even more self-healing properties, and could even mean that Life Strike on your melee weapon is optional while using Inaros. Tying neatly into his second passive, we'll open up how Inaros plays with his first ability, Desiccation. This acts similarly to Banshee's Sonic Boom, striking enemies in a cone in front of him. However, Desiccation instead staggers all enemies and renders them helpless and susceptible to finisher attacks for 8 seconds. This will affect enemies up to 15 meters away, deals 150 damage on hit, and then continues to deal 8 damage per second, of which 25% is given back to Inaros' health. The heal over time from Desiccation's damage is honestly completely forgettable, but opening enemies up to finishers allows Inaros to restore his health very quickly. In addition to that, it's a basic but reliable and fast crowd control ability that should see pretty frequent employment. As you might expect, the ability duration is affected by power duration, its range is affected by power range, and both of its damage sources are affected by power strength if you want to bother with that at all. Devour is Inaros' second ability and can be used in 2 ways. You can either tap the power button to trap a targeted enemy in quicksand for 30 seconds where they stand, or you can press and hold the key to drag the targeted enemy towards you from up to 50 meters away. In both cases, as the name may suggest, Devour allows either you or your allies to start devouring the enemy at no further energy cost, dealing 250 damage per second to the enemy affected by power strength and enemy armor, and restoring the health of the Devourer at a fixed rate, while also rendering the Warframe doing the eating immune to damage. This makes the ability very useful for health restore and allows someone to stall for time in the middle of a crowd of enemies. Though care should be taken while ending Devour, as you'll be locked in place for a couple of seconds while being vulnerable to damage. However, note that if a nullifier happens to saunter on by, it will disrupt the Devour ability. Devour also has its own extra feature if the enemy is killed through Devour by Inaros himself. And that is that it will create a sand shadow of the devoured enemy, much like Necros' Shadows of the Dead. This is a cool touch, but it honestly is a fairly useless addition. I say this because at higher levels you are realistically never going to kill an enemy through Devour because it does too little damage. The amount of time it would take to kill a single highly armored high level enemy with Devour is just unreasonable. Like over 5 minutes with the build I use unreasonable. I wish I was kidding. So beyond mid-level enemies you're probably never going to see any sand shadows running around. And to add insult to injury, if you go to the bother of eating an Eximus unit, you're going to get a grand total of absolutely nothing! Fortunately, the heal and invincibility allow Devour to remain useful even though its damage component is rather pitiful. Inaros' third ability is Sandstorm, and is a reasonable panic button for crowd control. At a cost of 75 energy on activation and 10 energy per second while active, he turns himself into a whirling cyclone of sand, dealing 500 damage per second over 15 meters, as well as lifting up any enemies caught in the storm to render them helpless. Inaros can still be damaged as he channels the ability, and his movement speed is slowed down, but Inaros will take a flat 50% less damage while casting. This works well with the Rage mod as well, as Inaros will be able to regain energy through Rage while using Sandstorm. As an additional bonus, Sandstorm will also draw in pickups towards Inaros while active, allowing him to act as his own souped-up carrier vacuum. Finally, if an enemy under the effect of Devour is killed by Sandstorm, then that will also create a sand shadow. Though again, the problem remains that you're realistically never going to get a sand shadow at high levels. But you can still use Sandstorm to mitigate some damage and throw enemies away to give you and your team some breathing room. Sandstorm's radius is affected by power range, damage per second is affected by power strength, while the damage reduction is not, initial casting cost is affected by power efficiency, and energy drain over time is affected by both power efficiency and duration. Finally, Inaros' fourth ability is Scarab Swarm and serves two purposes. First, while the ability button is held down, Inaros will assume a pose and begin converting his health into additional armor, without using any energy whatsoever. Up to 100% bonus armor. Each percent of bonus armor will require 29 points of health, resulting in a total health consumption of 2,900. Health drain will stop upon either reaching the maximum 100% bonus or upon being reduced to 2 health. Though, funnily enough, you can hold the pose for as long as you like. The maximum Scarab armor bonus will result in Inaros' armor being bumped up to 400 on its own, 620 with steel fiber, and a grand total of 710 with both steel fiber and armored agility. This bonus armor will stick around even after falling into a pit, which would normally remove buffs, though it can still be removed by the likes of nullifiers. Though in a pleasant display of fairness, the armor bonus will be refunded as health if it is removed in this way, provided Inaros' health isn't already full at the time. The second function of Scarab Swarm is to actually unleash swarms of scarabs. By tapping the ability key at a cost of 25 energy and removing a flat 25% from the bonus armor, meaning you can't throw out a swarm if you have less than 25% bonus armor, all enemies in a line based on where the swarm was targeted, up to 30 meters away, will be swarmed by scarabs and flail around helplessly. While in this state, every individual enemy will take 200 corrosive damage per second for 15 seconds, and will pulse a 15-meter radius healing aura based on the damage they receive from the scarabs. On top of all of that, any other enemies that wander within 5 meters of an affected enemy will themselves end up swarmed by scarabs as well. complete with damage and even more healing for whatever happens to be the remaining duration. So yeah, Scarab Swarm has a lot going on. This ability is probably going to be the most used ability in Inaros' arsenal, with Desiccation being a close second. Especially when cast in a choke point, even a single enemy hit by the swarm can end up ballooning into an entire enemy squad flailing around helplessly, all the while healing any of your allies that are in range. With a reasonably large group of enemies beset by the Scarabs, it will largely render anyone standing close invincible to the onslaught of any other enemies that happen to be around. Not to mention, the swarm is a good way to get the health back that was lost giving Inaros more armor in the first place. Scarab Swarm is survivability, crowd control, and healing all wrapped up into one package, and it's extremely powerful. Power strength will affect the swarm damage and healing over time, but not the armor bonus. Swarm duration is affected by power duration, and the swarm casting range is affected by power range, while the range of the Scarab spreading to unaffected enemies is not. It's a shame that the Sand Shadows just don't see much action at higher levels, but Inaros still has an extremely powerful moveset available to him even with that annoyance in mind. Your typical mission flow will probably be to give Inaros' armor at the start of a mission, and then use either a blast of Scarabs or a round of Desiccation and finisher attacks to restore the health he lost from the armor conversion. After that though, it'll be down to whatever the situation calls for. When it comes to modding Inaros, given that his abilities don't do much damage anyway, I have favoured going for a lot of range with both overextended and stretch to push the range out on his Desiccation, Sandstorm, and Scarab Swarm healing aura. Power Drift in the Exilus slot helps balance out some of the power strength loss. This is honestly entirely optional, but I like to have at least some more healing going on if only a small number of enemies get caught in Scarab Swarm. Adding on to that is power duration, including constitution because knockdown recovery is useful in general, and rounding things off with vitality paired with both steel fiber and armored agility to make Inaros a very tough customer indeed. And of course, rage is going to be extremely useful to make sure Inaros has a plentiful supply of energy to keep his abilities going. There is some room to play around with, adding on some efficiency would help the casting cost of Sandstorm especially, but for the most part, this feels like the way to go in general. You can, of course, favour power strength instead, but I have elected against that approach. With a large group of enemies caught up in Scarab Swarm, the healing going out is insane even at a minimum power strength, and none of his abilities do enough damage to be worth considering on that front, so that's my logic behind my choice of mods. All in all, Inaros is extremely good at what he does. He can get right in enemies' faces, lock entire legions down, keep teammates alive, and is himself almost immortal between his pretty bonkers health pool and ability to self-revive. Although unrelated to Inaros himself, I can't help but feel like Oberon was left out in the cold on this one. This kinda feels like exactly what Oberon should have been capable of, but Oberon's renewal is far too slow and his hollowed ground is often of very niche usefulness. But we do have Inaros, and he makes for a fantastic combat healer. Trinity's healing may be strictly speaking better, but Inaros also brings a shitload of crowd controls to the table, which should make him useful in pretty much any situation. Definitely a worthwhile Warframe. Thank you for watching my look at Inaros. All comments are appreciated, and I hope to see you around next time. For other Warframe reviews, feel free to click down below and check out my look at Nadja, or my feelings on the Dual Toxicist. Or for something completely different, I am also gradually playing through Dark Souls 3. And as always, good luck, have fun, and take care.